This is not how military access gets revoked. Most people think this is about Indigenous rights. The Canadian Indigenous Arctic Council issuing statements about territorial sovereignty and traditional land use, protocol discussions between Indigenous leaders and military planners, the kind of consultation process that fills government publications and gets covered by Indigenous affairs reporters. But when the Indigenous Arctic Council formally rejects American military access to Canadian Arctic territory under Indigenous jurisdiction, that is not routine consultation. That is the systematic elimination of American strategic positioning in the region. Washington assumed it could access through alliance agreements regardless of Indigenous consent. For 70 years, Arctic military cooperation meant American access with Indigenous consultation as ceremonial courtesy. The Pentagon planned Arctic operations with Canadian government approval and Indigenous communities receiving notification after decisions were made. American military exercises occurred on Indigenous territory with Indigenous consent, assumed rather than requested. Arctic defense infrastructure was positioned according to strategic requirements, with Indigenous concerns addressed through compensation rather than genuine consultation. Indigenous sovereignty was acknowledged in principle, but ignored in practice when American strategic interests demanded Arctic access. Trump destroyed that arrangement in 48 months, not through direct confrontation with Indigenous communities, but by threatening Canadian sovereignty so aggressively that Indigenous leaders recognized American reliability as fundamentally compromised. First with annexation rhetoric that treated Canadian territory like potential American acquisition. Then with Arctic claims that dismissed Indigenous territorial rights as obstacles to American strategic positioning. Then with explicit demands that Canada subordinate Indigenous consent to American military requirements. He assumed Indigenous consultation was procedural theater that could be bypassed when American strategic interests required immediate Arctic access. That Indigenous territorial rights were subordinate to alliance obligations that superseded domestic consultation requirements. Instead, he forced Indigenous communities to recognize that American military access threatened Indigenous sovereignty more than it protected Canadian security. Mary Simon announced the Indigenous Arctic Council decision in Iqaluit, February 15, 2026. Not in Ottawa, where federal protocols would require American consultation, not through NATO channels where Pentagon could argue strategic necessity. In Nunavut's capital, standing beside Inuit Circumpolar Council President Sarah Olsvig, speaking directly to an audience of Arctic Indigenous leaders from across the circumpolar world, including representatives from Greenland, Alaska, northern Scandinavia, and Siberia. The statement was unprecedented. The Indigenous Arctic Council, representing Inuit, First Nations, and Métis communities across the Canadian Arctic, formally declared that American military access to Indigenous territory was incompatible with Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. Military exercises, defense infrastructure, and strategic positioning that had operated for decades were being terminated because Indigenous communities no longer trusted American intentions toward Indigenous territorial rights. This was not symbolic protest. This was the legal termination of military access agreements that had enabled American Arctic operations for generations. Arctic Indigenous territory encompasses the majority of strategically significant Canadian Arctic land. Nunavut covers 2 million square kilometers, including the Northwest Passage approaches. Indigenous territories in Northwest Territories and northern Quebec control access to mineral resources and shipping infrastructure. Inuit communities possess constitutionally protected rights over traditional territories that include the most strategically important locations for Arctic military positioning. American Arctic strategy depended on Indigenous territorial access because geographic positioning required Indigenous consent under Canadian constitutional law. Military radar installations on Indigenous territory, Arctic training exercises across Indigenous hunting grounds, defense infrastructure positioned according to strategic requirements that intersected with Indigenous territorial rights. The entity that controls Indigenous territorial consent controls American military positioning throughout the Canadian Arctic. Every radar installation, every training exercise, every defense infrastructure project becomes either permitted or prohibited depending on Indigenous community decisions about American military access. For decades, the United States maintained Arctic military presence through agreements that treated Indigenous consent as administrative procedure rather than substantive sovereignty. Pentagon planners assumed Indigenous communities would approve American military access because alliance obligations and security requirements superseded Indigenous territorial rights. That assumption just collapsed through Indigenous coordination that treats American military access as incompatible with Indigenous sovereignty. The Indigenous Arctic Council brings together comprehensive territorial authority that collectively controls American Arctic access. Inuit communities hold constitutional rights over Arctic territory, including the Northwest Passage and northern approaches to the continent. First Nations control access to Arctic mineral resources and transportation infrastructure. Métis communities possess territorial rights in regions essential for Arctic defense coordination. Combined, Indigenous communities can deny American military access to Canadian Arctic territory through constitutional rights that supersede alliance agreements requiring Indigenous territorial use. The strategic implications are transformative. American Arctic military operations that required Indigenous territorial access are being terminated. Defense infrastructure positioned on Indigenous territory faces removal or abandonment. Arctic training exercises across Indigenous hunting grounds are being prohibited. For the first time since NORAD was established, American Arctic military strategy must operate without access to the territories that provide strategic positioning for continental defense. The Council decision established 3 parallel termination tracks that will fundamentally alter American Arctic military capability within 18 months. First, immediate termination of existing American military access agreements. Indigenous communities are withdrawing consent for American military operations on Indigenous territory, regardless of previous agreements or strategic justifications. Military radar installations on Indigenous territory in Nunavut and Northwest Territories are being required to cease operations. American military personnel stationed at facilities on Indigenous territory are being ordered to withdraw. Defense infrastructure that requires Indigenous territorial access is being shut down despite Pentagon protests about strategic necessity. Indigenous communities are exercising constitutional rights that supersede American military requirements. When Indigenous territorial sovereignty conflicts with American strategic positioning, Indigenous sovereignty prevails under Canadian constitutional law. Second, prohibition of future American military access to Indigenous territory. The Council decision applies to all future American military operations that would require Indigenous territorial consent. American Arctic training exercises that cross Indigenous hunting grounds are prohibited. Military infrastructure development on Indigenous territory is banned. Strategic positioning that requires Indigenous territorial access is denied regardless of alliance agreements or continental defense arguments. Indigenous communities are treating American military access as inherently incompatible with Indigenous territorial rights and self-determination. Future consent will not be granted because American military presence threatens Indigenous sovereignty more than it provides security benefits. Third, coordination with international Indigenous communities to restrict American Arctic military access globally. Arctic Indigenous peoples maintain connections across national borders that transcend state sovereignty. Greenlandic Inuit communities are coordinating with Canadian Indigenous communities to restrict American military access throughout the Arctic. Alaskan Indigenous communities are questioning American military operations on Indigenous territory. Siberian Indigenous peoples are coordinating with circumpolar Indigenous networks to assert territorial rights against military occupation. Indigenous Arctic solidarity operates independently of state borders and alliance agreements. When Canadian Indigenous communities reject American military access, Indigenous communities throughout the Arctic recognize American military presence as threatening to Indigenous territorial rights everywhere. The constitutional implications compound the strategic challenges. Indigenous territorial rights in Canada are constitutionally protected through Section 35 of the Constitution Act and treaty rights that recognize Indigenous sovereignty over traditional territories. Canadian federal government cannot override Indigenous territorial decisions to serve American military requirements. When Indigenous communities withdraw consent for military access, the federal government has no constitutional authority to grant American military access against Indigenous territorial sovereignty. Legal challenges to Indigenous territorial decisions would require the federal government to argue that American military requirements supersede constitutionally protected Indigenous rights. Constitutional courts would likely rule that Indigenous territorial sovereignty cannot be subordinated to foreign military access, regardless of alliance obligations. American military access to Canadian Arctic territory requires Indigenous consent that cannot be compelled, overruled, or bypassed through federal government agreements that ignore Indigenous constitutional rights. The Pentagon response reveals fundamental misunderstanding of Indigenous territorial authority. Military officials are arguing that continental defense requirements supersede Indigenous territorial rights. Strategic planners are claiming that alliance obligations require Indigenous communities to subordinate territorial sovereignty to American military access. Pentagon leadership is treating Indigenous territorial decisions as federal government consultation failure, rather than legitimate exercise of constitutional rights. American military strategy assumed Indigenous consent was procedural requirement rather than substantive sovereignty that could deny military access based on Indigenous community decisions. Constitutional law experts are explaining that Indigenous territorial rights cannot be overruled to serve American military requirements. Alliance agreements between federal governments cannot supersede Indigenous constitutional rights that exist independently of federal government authority. American military access to Indigenous territory requires genuine consent that reflects Indigenous community decisions, rather than federal government agreements that ignore Indigenous territorial sovereignty. The broader implications affect American Arctic strategy beyond Canadian territory. Alaska Native communities are observing Canadian Indigenous territorial assertion and reconsidering American military access to Alaska Native territorial lands. American Arctic military infrastructure in Alaska operates on Alaska Native territory through agreements that assumed Indigenous consent would continue regardless of American military behavior toward Indigenous communities elsewhere. When Alaska Native communities observe American military access being rejected by Canadian Indigenous communities due to threats against Indigenous territorial sovereignty, Alaska Native communities must consider whether American military access threatens their own territorial rights. Indigenous territorial solidarity operates across international borders. American military threats against Indigenous sovereignty in Canada create Indigenous resistance against American military access throughout the Arctic. The economic implications compound the strategic losses. Indigenous communities control access to Arctic mineral resources that American companies assumed they could develop through federal government agreements, regardless of Indigenous territorial rights. Rare earth mineral deposits on Indigenous territory, critical minerals essential for defense manufacturing, energy resources that require Indigenous territorial access for extraction operations, all potentially subject to Indigenous territorial decisions that prioritize sovereignty over resource development, serving American strategic requirements. American resource extraction companies built development plans assuming Indigenous consent could be obtained through federal government negotiations and compensation agreements. When Indigenous communities assert territorial sovereignty that supersedes resource development serving American strategic interests, extraction operations become impossible regardless of federal government support. Indigenous territorial sovereignty applies to resource extraction as comprehensively as military access. American companies cannot develop Arctic resources on Indigenous territory without genuine Indigenous consent that reflects community decisions rather than federal government agreements. The international precedent matters globally. Other Indigenous communities worldwide are observing Arctic Indigenous territorial assertion and recognizing possibilities for asserting territorial sovereignty against military access they never genuinely consented to. Pacific Indigenous communities questioning American military base access. Indigenous peoples in strategic locations reconsidering military infrastructure positioned on Indigenous territory without genuine consent. Traditional territories being reasserted against military occupation justified through colonial agreements that ignored Indigenous sovereignty. Indigenous territorial rights exist globally wherever Indigenous peoples maintain connections to traditional territories. American military access to Indigenous territory worldwide requires genuine Indigenous consent rather than colonial agreements that subordinated Indigenous sovereignty to military strategic requirements. The alliance coordination reveals sophisticated Indigenous political strategy that operates independently of state government control. Indigenous communities across the Arctic are coordinating territorial rights assertion through traditional governance structures that predate and supersede colonial state boundaries. Inuit communities across Canada, Greenland, and Alaska are coordinating territorial rights strategies. Indigenous communities throughout the Arctic are sharing information about military access impacts on territorial sovereignty. Traditional governance systems are asserting authority that colonial state governments cannot override through alliance agreements. Indigenous political coordination operates through traditional systems that exist independently of colonial state authority. When Indigenous communities coordinate territorial rights assertion, colonial state governments discover their authority over Indigenous territory is limited rather than absolute. American military strategy assumed Indigenous territorial access could be maintained through federal government agreements regardless of Indigenous community decisions. Indigenous Arctic territorial coordination demonstrates that assumption was fundamentally false. Trump wanted to demonstrate American strategic dominance over Arctic territory regardless of Indigenous consent. Instead, he triggered Indigenous territorial rights assertion that terminates American Arctic military access across the region. By the time Pentagon acknowledges the strategic implications, American military infrastructure on Indigenous territory will already be shut down. Indigenous territorial sovereignty will already be asserted across the Arctic. American Arctic military strategy will already operate without access to the territories that provided strategic positioning for continental defense. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. Arctic military access is shifting from American assumption toward Indigenous territorial sovereignty that supersedes alliance agreements. Military strategy is restructuring around Indigenous consent rather than colonial state authority that ignores Indigenous territorial rights. Strategic positioning is becoming dependent on Indigenous community decisions rather than federal government agreements that subordinated Indigenous sovereignty to military requirements. The Pentagon assumed Indigenous territorial access was permanent regardless of American behavior toward Indigenous sovereignty. Indigenous communities just demonstrated that assumption was strategically catastrophic for American Arctic military capability.